Awesome. Alrighty. G'day everyone, Ethan Nash from TOTTnews.com back here again today with another MC podcast for the month of July, and this month we are starting to begin our descent down the rabbit hole, so to speak, here on the website. And I have another guest joining me here tonight to discuss all things relating to the latest feature piece on our website, and we're going to get a glimpse of some of the work that he does and he's involved in, and just have a general chat, about the state of Australia. So tonight, as I mentioned, I've got a guest, and I'm joined by Bradley, who is the WA president of the Australian Protectionist Party, or APP, who is jumping on to have a little bit of a chat about the party and traditions in Western society. Bradley, thank you, mate, for taking the time out over there in Perth. How are you this evening over there, mate?
Yeah, I'm very well, thanks, mate, and thank you very much for this opportunity. I really do appreciate it.
No, thanks for joining us, mate. The pleasure is all ours, and I'm looking forward to having a chat with you here tonight, just to get your perspective on things, and give more context to obviously some of the work that we've been doing here on the website. And in this episode, what I want to do is just have a quick chat about all things relating to humans, the human nature, our culture, and more specifically, this sort of dehumanization of society that we've seen, that is now, it's sort of manifesting into what we're seeing becoming the post-humanist era, this sort of merging and expanding of technology, and just sort of give some context on what I believe is a fundamental need to sort of recognize traditions and what made us human in the first place going forward, and obviously just a transition to true world theories as a means to combat what we see as somewhat of a desolate, somewhat of a, let's say, a disconnected society from some of the things that built us to this point and made our country great. But before we get into any of that, what I'd like to do, I always like to give guests the opportunity to introduce themselves and tell our members what they're all about on the website. So Bradley, if you wouldn't mind, mate, spend a little time just telling us a little bit about yourself and more importantly, what APP is all about, the Australian Protectionist Party.
Thanks very much, Ethan. Yeah, I'm the West Australian chairman or president of the Australian Protectionist Party. I've been in this role since 2013. The Australian Protectionist Party first began in, or at least the revamped version of the Australian Protectionist Party began in 2007. I joined the party that year, and the original Australian Protectionist Party was around at the time of the foundation of Australia. The first two Prime Ministers of Australia, Edmund Barton and Alfred Deakin, were both members of the original Australian Protectionist Party. And it was thought back in, about 2007 that it was basically Australian nationalism at the time, and we are a nationalist party, but at the time it was sort of like there was definitely quite a sort of a lull in the nationalist scene, or at least as far as political parties were concerned. The Australian Protectionist Party had pretty much branched out from the Australia First Party because there had been quite a bit of discontent within that party. It was also a period there in about the mid-noughties where One Nation had sort of gone into decline. Pauline Hanson had sort of, left the political scene. She was sort of off doing TV stuff like Dancing with the Stars, and there was a bit of a void there to be filled. And so Australian Protectionist Party was started in 2007, and I had a good friend who was involved in the party. He was the original West Australian chairman, and so it looked very obvious to me that this was the party to join and be involved in, because I thought that, they were the party that had good people involved in the organisation, that had the right sort of policies and philosophy and ideology, and it was something that I felt that Australia needed at the time, and so I got involved with the party, and I guess I've been a stalwart of it since then. We probably haven't made the electoral progress that we would have liked to, but that's the nature of Australian politics. It's not easy for micro parties to really gain a strong sort of a foothold and to really make a huge impact, because so much of the Australian political system is about, rigged toward the status quo and rigged toward the major parties, and it's all about sort of trying to keep new parties or new ideas out from, really making much impact. And so I think the other thing with regards to the whole, political culture is that I think we're sort of living at a time of, I think, some pretty radical social and technological and cultural change. And I think that, one of the things that micro parties can do, like ours, is, just help to contribute to that change, help to what I call make a contribution to that change, to that what's the term? It's like, just keep chipping away at the damn wall, help to wake people up, help to red pill people, help to change the way things are going.
Mm-hmm. Yep. Yeah, no, that's fantastic, mate. And you mentioned, I going back to a point that you mentioned there, as just to expand on that, you were talking about, obviously, it is very hard for some of the minor parties to make a difference. Obviously, we see that, the only real place you can make any difference is within the Senate, because they just can't, independent parties just can't reach the mass number of electorates around the country to be on all of these House of Representative votes. So it just sort of skews back into the two-party paradigm. But one of the things that I've always liked about independent parties has been just what you've mentioned there, mate, is it's not necessarily about, getting into politics or doing any of this stuff. It's more about the social presence, the image, and, as you said, contributing to what is a rapid shift in society, and especially with information being at the key of that. And I think that that's really important, and that's what I like about the Australian Protectionist Party. We included it on our list of independent political parties to support in 2019, an article that we did on our website. And one of the things that I love about APP is that you're continuously sharing a lot of content that's relating to things that are a direct result of, let's say, globalism. And more importantly, you share a lot of things that have an underlying tone of a shift of tradition in Australia and abroad, which I think is a real key component of every society. So just in terms of some of the perceptions that I've seen, just, Facebook and all that type of stuff, you're always sharing a lot of content. Could you expand a little bit, Bradley, on some of the key topics that APP stands for? Obviously, I know that you're a nationalist party. You seem like you're very anti-globalism, against things like free, international trade pacts that hurt our country, the UN takeover, all this type of stuff. Can you sort of expand just a little bit on some of the key topics that APP are sort of standing for here in Australia, mate?
Yeah, thanks, Ethan. Yeah, you're absolutely on the money there. We are indeed a nationalist party that, like most nationalist parties, really wants to sort of return Australia to having sovereignty, getting back to what Australia was originally actually founded on, that it was about. If you go back to 1901, when we were first founded, that it was about Fortress Australia, it was about our people having sovereignty, it was about being a proud people that were able to like stand on their own 2 feet and not be too reliant on foreign countries or foreign trade or foreign immigrant labour, or it was about having a degree of, I mean, that's what independence is about. It's about being able to sort of, manage things for yourself and not being too reliant on others, because there's sort of certain pitfalls that come with being too reliant on the rest of the world or too reliant on foreign peoples. And so I think that with the shift in consciousness, and obviously, us becoming increasingly part of a world that's becoming much, much smaller, not just because of technology, but also because of radical immigration and population and demographic changes, and the whole free trade thing, the whole, importation of large amounts of materials and people from different parts of the world. And it was sort of a view that we needed to sort of like get back to our basics, get back to our origins, get back to our roots, and move us back toward where we felt Australia should be rather than where we've been going. I think that, this whole liberal global internationalist order that's sort of been dominant in the post-World War II era has, it may have been of advantage to some people or even possibly some nations, but we don't believe that it's been to Australia's advantage. We think that Australia is absolutely been a declining and degenerating society in many ways. We've got a society of, I think, much lower social capital or community trust than we once had. I think that if you sort of like look at the history of Australia, I mean, even during very tough times like the 1930s when they had the Great Depression, or the early 1940s when they had the World War II, or even during World War One, the times were very tough for Australians back then during that period. But I think, there were also things that really binded Australians together back in those days. There were things like, the common culture and the common ancestry, and being, proud of who we were as a people and being able to stand up independently. And then when we were threatened by the Japanese in World War II, we were able to come together and meet that threat and counter that threat. And yet since, the post-World War II era and the radical changes that have been happening to Australia, I mean, we see that as not actually benefiting Australia. It's something that, it might have been benefiting the big corporations or the banks or the political class or the political elites who are, I think, largely serving the interests of the big corporations and the banks and the bureaucrats and what have you. But there's sort of like been a chasm there, a clash there between our elites sort of serving the interests of other elites, but not serving the interests of the people that I call or perceive as being the normies or normal people. I sort of like try to make that distinction sometimes between the elites on the one hand and the normies on the other hand. But I think, where we're at as a society now, it's like, the elites have the power, they have the influence, they have the control, but whose interests are they serving? Are they acting altruistically? Are they acting in the interests of the normies? Are they really trying to make our lives, our country, our nation, our societies, our communities better? Or are they really just trying to continue to make profits and maintain the status quo that they've created? I mean, I think that, sadly, the leadership that Australia's had for the last few decades has, I think, quite frankly, been appalling leadership. I don't think it's been good leadership at all. I think it's been appalling leadership, and I think that that's why we need to have political parties like the Australian Protectionist Party that at least offer an alternative to what's sort of dominating the agenda at the moment.
Absolutely, mate. I couldn't have said it better myself. And I completely agree with you just on that distinction between, back in the day, even though there were tough times, you mentioned World War One, World War Two, all of these things that had happened throughout the 20th century, we still had this commonality that bonded us together, that sort of got us through that time, almost the spirit of our nation, if you want to call it that. And things have gradually, obviously, just sort of increased over time to where that's sort of just disintegrated due to a number of reasons. And I just want to get your thoughts, mate, on just your personal experiences. I'm only a younger person in context, and even in my lifetime, I've seen radical shifts just in who we are as a nation, in terms of our social interactions, in terms of how we perceive the world, how we perceive each other, how we have an outlook on life, how we conduct ourselves. All of this type of stuff has been the aftermath of some of these giant sort of international interests that you're speaking about, that have sort of wrapped a spider web around the world, if you can describe it as that, and are sort of almost, tearing apart the fabrics of each nation one by one. And we're starting to see that here in Australia start to increase. But I want to get your thoughts, mate, because when I was a young person, I just remember, Australia being a nation of, a humorous nation, a frank nation, an outgoing nation. We were known to have a good time, to speak our mind, all that type of stuff. And now we see that we're a much different culture. So I've seen that sort of transition. I'm interested to get your perspective on, in your lifetime, mate, what are some of the things that you've noticed change here in this country, and what are some of the reasons you think are behind some of those changes, mate?
Yeah, that's a very good sort of broad area of questioning. And no doubt, the influence of political correctness, or what we call political correctness, which is derived from cultural Marxism. And I think that's something that's, if you go back and sort of understand it historically, I think the major changes that happened in the Western world undoubtedly happened, I think, during that period of what's known as the counterculture revolution. I think the 1960s and 70s was a major tumultuous period of change in the West, and probably in almost all Western countries, really, or Western European-based countries, certainly Anglosphere countries, of which Australia is an Anglosphere country. And, our people, the dominant people in Australia, obviously, even right now and right throughout, our history as being a civilization, have been, basically Anglo-Celtic people. And yet we began to see, certainly in the 60s, with the new radical social movements that happened, also changing technology, the invention of the birth control pill, some of the changes that came from the United States as well, with obviously they had the Vietnam War over there, and I think that created a lot of social changes. There was the change in music, change in culture, the creation of new drugs and people using mind-altering experimental stuff, and probably a wider sort of access to various forms of indulgences, whether it be sexual or alcohol or various types of drugs or gambling, or all sorts of changes. Also the rise of feminism, the rise of environmentalism, a lot of those changes that happened in that period. And I don't mean to say that all those changes were bad either, because they weren't all bad. I think some of them in some ways were actually probably very good or very useful or very necessary. Or I think, if you understand, one of the main areas was probably like the environment. I think before that period, there was, very much a sense that, the environment was there for us to plunder and, chop down all the trees, and it doesn't matter if you pollute all the rivers. And whereas I think during that period, people did become a lot more environmentally conscious. They had to realise, hang on, we need to, maybe preserve the forest and maybe not pollute the rivers, or we need to look after the soil because we've got this problem with soil erosion, and we want to be able to feed our society in the future, and protecting the natural environment is very important. But whilst just at the same time that we've sort of been protecting the natural environment, I think there's been so much emphasis on protecting the natural environment, I think that our human social environment, I think, has been absolutely in decline. I don't think we have had a strengthened human social environment at all. I think we're actually degenerating our what's known as social capital, which is sort of like community trust, is something that's absolutely been degenerating. And there's not any one reason why. I think it's a multitude of reasons why. Some of it is because of changes in technology. I think that as we've made technological advancement, I think that our tendency to become more disconnected from each other as we become more technologically astute. I mean, just to use an example, I live in like a complex of units, and the power doesn't go off very often here. The electricity power doesn't go off very often. But when it does, it's like, the way people react is that often they'll go outside and start talking to their neighbours. Whereas when that's the time when the power's on, it's like, people are indoors and watching television, or doing what they do, mucking around on their computers, or doing what they do with technology, because we've become so familiar with technology. When suddenly you don't have that technology, people are like, oh, what the hell do I do?
Yeah.
Yeah. And it's like, I think, obviously now we've got things like, social media, we've got some mobile phones, we've got, and that's changing the way people interact with each other. Again, there's probably some benefits in that. There's probably some pitfalls in that. But obviously it is changing us. I know another thing that's significant was that, like back in the day, a few decades ago, I think Australians were much more likely to be involved with various forms of community groups. And that might involve, whether it's your local dancing club or your Lions club or your Rotary club, or your people were much more involved in groups. They were more committed to their community, just a sporting club or social club or chess club or bridge club or whatever. It's like people, and obviously religion as well, with churches and that sort of thing, those sorts of things sort of brought people together. But now I think with the changing technology, people are less involved with their communities, they're less involved with their societies, they're less inclined to volunteer. I think volunteerism has also been, in decline. I think, people have become more selfish, more materialistic, more consumerist. And, that's all part of, I think, breaking down that community trust and social capital and demoralizing our people. I mean, there's lots of complicated factors as to why, but I think that's the general trend that's been happening.
Yeah, absolutely, mate. And you gave some fantastic examples there. I've included a couple of those in the feature piece that I've written, just sort of detailing some of the thoughts that I believe about that. Obviously, you mentioned cultural Marxism was a huge thing, the cultural Marxist movement and all of the spin-offs that you've mentioned, some of these social movements that sort of radically transformed some of these Western nations across the world, which we went into detail on our website, speaking about, authors like Gustav Le Bon and Sigmund Freud, who sort of understood how people work collectively in groups. And then schools like the Frankfurt School and critical theory were developed to sort of implement this. So cultural Marxism, absolutely, I definitely believe is a massive part of this shift. I also mentioned the establishment of the education system of schooling, When you read some of the prior works of people like Alexander Ingalls and these people that sort of founded education, and they're not really talking about how it's there to educate people. It's there more to assign you to be a collective member of society. And you've got to remember, schooling is a fairly recent thing. Only up until, the last couple of 100 years did it become institutionalized. Before that, it was more of an organic sort of community-based education of society. And obviously, again, not saying either of these things are good or bad, but these are key things that I think sort of influence society. And I also talk about eugenics. Some of these people, like Sir Francis Galton, who was the cousin of Charles Darwin, who wanted to better humankind through genetic science and genetic breeding, and all of these type of eugenic organizations that really sort of infiltrated science and sort of dictated the direction of the planet, just sort of based on their own perceptions of what humans are. And when I started to look at all of this evidence, and also some of, obviously, all of the points that you just explained there, Bradley, I started to see a pattern of dehumanization, if that makes sense, of not in the individual sense of you're dehumanizing another, but more of a systemic dehumanization of cultures and societies that really sort of ate away at what we describe as, obviously, the spirit of our communities. You know what I mean? A lot of these people were responsible for technology. A lot of these people were responsible for advancing a lot of these things that have disrupted our society. So I wanted to take a look back and just try to see, where I could find where this begins, where this sort of shift sort of manifested within society. And I started to sort of ask the question, well, if you're going to look at it from a dehumanizing perspective, you have to understand sort of what it is to be human in the first place, where our sort of emotions and stuff come from for this type of thing, like communities and all this. And we obviously historically have bonded on a number of things that you mentioned, Bradley, talking about culture and race and common identity and common ancestors and all of these things. But another thing that I noticed that we strongly related on was, in a sort of a loose word, faith or spiritualism, or belief in something that was higher than ourselves and the community. And I started to recognize a pattern where all of these things started to manifest really after society as a whole, as Friedrich Nietzsche described it, the death of God. As the death of God happened, a new scientific age came upon us. And from that point, individuals and societies sort of lost their belief in true world theories. So what I've put here in the introduction of the membership piece here is, what is man? This age-old question can be found embedded in the fabric of recorded human history and is re-emerging again today with increased urgency, given the current technological developments levering out traditional humanist reflexes. As a wave of enlightenment spread across the world, humanity lost faith in the divine of the individual, which led to the rise of intellectual barbarianism and the dehumanization of society. And I argue today, with no moral framework to guide the perceptions of our reality, and an approaching post-human era that's approaching us, it's going to present the final piece needed for society to transcend all that was once human. So I'm sort of explaining in this piece, talking more of a philosophical sort of futuristic and retrospective sort of philosophical perspective on this. But the underlying notion that I wanted to express was that a world of faith and personal convictions has now transformed to a world of spiritually infected cultures, which I believe are sort of crying out in search of an existential meaning of reality. That's why we're creating all of this stuff. That's why we're so frantic to keep progressing, and no one sort of respects culture anymore. So and religious beliefs. So that's why the multicultural thing is happening and all this type of stuff. And subsequently, what I believe is this loss of true world theories will in turn lead to the rise. Well, it did lead to the rise. So what happened was one day we had true world theories where we believed we were the center of the universe. This happened, and whether you're religious or not, that's not really the point. What we're talking about is the structural change, not just in society, but in the minds of people that changed after obviously people lost their faith in something bigger than themselves. They weren't the center of the universe anymore. They were just another fragment here in reality. And as soon as, you know, we've started to see this trend of the more that we've lost faith, even if it's not just faith in the biblical texts and all this type of stuff, but we've just lost faith in something bigger than ourselves, whatever it is. And I think that this was a key underlying feature that led humans to believe, well, I'm better than you, or I can control you, or I want to learn what you are, because these elitists that established these international organizations now believed that they were God. And this is what has led fundamentally in the underlying presence to all of these systems, to all of this downfall by people that really started to believe that they could tap into the divine, if that makes sense. So I know that was a bit of a philosophical sort of tangent there, mate, but I wanted to get your thoughts on what are your experiences just with this notion of a decline in human nature, so to speak, in this country, on top of everything else that we've just talking about. Have you seen Australia, and can you identify with this sort of argument that I'm talking about the importance of how also a decline in a spiritual sense to the traditionalist values that we once instilled based off of spiritualism? Do you think that also has somewhat of an effect given what we've seen over a generational period, mate?
Yeah, look, I think your insight there is really quite brilliant. I think you're absolutely on the money with all of that. Everything you've said there, I think, is just fantastic. So well done.
Thank you, mate.
But yeah, look, what you said there about education, I think, was very interesting and very true as well. And I think you're quite right about, you know, the modern education system has been a very sort of really a very historically recent sort of an invention, and yet, you know, we perceive the school system as being nowadays as being something that's completely sort of normal or completely inevitable or whatever. Whereas, you know, back in the day, you know, before the invention of sort of like mainstream schooling in the West, which really only became sort of like mainstream sort of like about midway through the 19th century. But before that, you know, people, obviously there was a greater divide in Western society between people who were like the wealthy class and the peasant sort of thing. I think that was sort of significant. So you sort of like had the elites and the wealthy people who had access to various forms of education, whereas the peasants were sort of kind of kept a bit dumbed down and ignorant and uneducated. I think, you know, at the same time, certainly in much more tribal societies and much more traditional societies, there had always been, you know, forms of education, especially with regard to maybe, say, grandparents. I think that grandparents once, and not just grandparents, but also like the extended family, uncles and great aunties, and that sort of would play a bigger role in people's lives, and they would play a bigger role in educating children. I think, you know, that was kind of like perceived as being the natural role in for grandparents in a society was to help to educate their grandchildren, to pass on their wisdom and their knowledge and their life experience and that. And that's something that I think is very true of many more traditional and more if I can use the word primitive sort of cultures. I think that's very true. But since we've sort of especially in England, they had like the Industrial Revolution, which was sort of probably, I think, 17th or 18th century. The Industrial Revolution really came into being, and that radically changed the society at the time from being a more agricultural or agrarian society with lots more people living in country towns and having a bigger sense of community with each other in those environments. And then suddenly you're sort of like getting all of these factories starting up in the big cities, and that sort of brought a lot of people from the regional and rural areas into the cities, and for the work and the money that was available for them there. And that changed society a lot. And I think that's also what sort of, led to the creation of the modern schooling system as well, because, you sort of had all of these children in the streets and in the suburbs and that, and their parents were, working in factories or whatever. And it sort of became a case of, well, somebody has to look after those children sort of thing. And then, it becomes not just a matter of managing them, but also controlling them and conditioning them for the employment system, or to serve the government or the corporations or whatever, or just to keep them out of trouble or whatever the agenda was. But I think that that certainly changed our modern day society. And Australia is obviously, since we became a nation in 1901, we've always had an education system that's based on the schooling system, and there's always been that sense of everyone should have sort of equal access to it, and teaching the basics such as reading and writing and arithmetic. And then of course it becomes increasingly used by the cultural Marxists and by the controllers to sort of impose their agenda and to manipulate and mold our children in the way that they want to sort of mold them. And so it's probably like a lot of things, it's a bit of a double-edged sword. And good luck to all those homeschoolers out there.
Yes, well, all the homeschoolers, you've seen that. Have you seen the news, how much it's increasing? We did a piece on our website a couple years ago talking about the rise of home education in Australia. It's tripled. It's tripled in numbers in 5 years here in Queensland, where I'm from. It's really taken off. Have you seen any of that sort of progress on the educational front at all, mate?
No, I haven't. I have to admit, I don't pay a lot of attention to education myself. It's not really my area. But to read something like that, to me, is that's fantastic. I think that's just great. And it shouldn't really surprise us that much because of, some of the changes that are kind of happening in our society, and the fact that, people are becoming more suspicious of the elites and more suspicious of the system, and just that sense that, I don't trust you with my children, I'd rather educate them myself. I think that's a very healthy attitude given the changing nature of our society and the increasing encroachment and authoritarian nature of, the whole bureaucratic system. So I think that's very encouraging, and I hope it continues.
Yeah, absolutely, mate. And we're seeing a lot of rising of alternative schools, schools that are popping up with sort of different alternative methods to teaching. So obviously the current schooling method is a transmission model where obviously the teacher transmit information to the students and they receive it, where it's sort of more of an authoritarian role, where you've got all of these other sort of methods that are starting to grow, like freedom-based learning, social constructivist learning, all of these type of methods that have been developed all over the world. You see, like, people are starting to enroll their kids in schools that are just solely focused on tech and learning how to code and learning how to use and build and everything with computers. You know what I mean? Like, people are sort of adapting to the modern era because they're sort of starting to see that, although beneficial potentially when it first started because of all the issues that you were sort of talking about that sort of gap in educational coverage of society. It's more to the elites of the time, whereas education was good for that sense. But I think a lot of people have started to recognize more of the infiltration of the education system, the rewriting of the curriculums to teach this type of cultural Marxism, and it's out of control these days. You know what I mean? Talking about gender studies, and they even teach kids about terrorism in school, and all this type of stuff that really just paints a picture that just comes directly from the source of the party. You know what I mean? So a lot of people are starting to switch, which is a fantastic thing. And I think it's good because when you do go back and read, as I said, someone like Alexander Ingalls, who they call the father of secondary education, when he wrote his book, The Principles of Secondary Education, he was talking about what the purpose of education is, and it was for unity of thought, to conform people to become producers and workers of society, to teach people, to not explore their creativity and whatnot. You know what I mean? One of his words in the book was to say, we've got enough thinkers and poets, we need workers now. And when you start to see that, that's why I sort of included in the piece, because I was sort of arguing that, well, that is a key shift in if you want to talk about dehumanization, that's textbook dehumanization. You're now grabbing an entire society across multiple generations, and you're almost you're judging a whole bunch of animals on how to climb a tree. You know what I mean? There might be a fish there who's great at swimming in the water, but only the monkeys are going to be graded because they can climb the tree. So it was almost boxing people into being a conformed society, whilst also indoctrinating them with some of these things, obviously across the whole 20th century and today, that sort of pushed this social unease, that have sort of pushed this culture war here in Australia. So I think a lot of people definitely do overlook the education system and the role that it's played. And I definitely encourage people listening to this, if you haven't gone and checked out some of the work of people like Alexander Ingalls and Horace Mann and all these people that were founders of the modern education system out of Oxford and Harvard and some of these universities, you might start to get a different perspective on what the true purpose of education was about. So I included that just in the piece, just in regards to, this systematic dehumanization of society. And I don't think it's a coincidence that all of these things are happening. And I included it because the first key to understanding dehumanization is, as I mentioned, to understand what it is to be human in the first place. And humans are full of creativity. We've got countless studies all over the world to talk about, the power of the individual mind and in individualism. So when we get boxed into groups, whether it be schools, whether we get boxed into groups, whether it be through eugenics, whether it be through social identities, through cultural Marxism and all of this, that's where you start to get suspicious and say, well, perhaps, mate, this wasn't an organic process, all of this destabilization of society. Perhaps there might have been people behind the scenes, behind these major institutions, that have wanted this. So I wanted to throw over to you now, mate, just to get your thoughts on that. What are your thoughts about this process? Do you think that this has all happened organically, just due to the vast increase of everything that we've seen, populations, technology, and everything across the centuries? Or do you think that something's a bit fishy behind the scenes here, mate?
Yeah, that's interesting. Obviously, I think there's an element of both factors, and then I don't know how deep we want to get into metaphysics and that sort of stuff, but whether we believe in demonic entities or that sort of thing, whether they've got something to do with it, I don't really know. But certainly, I think you're quite right. There's a lot of manipulation of that system. And I think a lot of it kind of gets back to the way that the elites kind of view humanity. I think we've sort of got a society now where the people in positions of power and influence, let's call them the ruling class elites, it's like they sort of like have their sort of clique, and they want to be the people in charge. They want to be the people in power. They want to be the people in control. They want to be like God or gods or whatever. And they want to keep everybody else kind of, either weak or controlled or distracted or busy working for the man or, busy working for the corporations. And it's like, I think that's what Australia has sort of like become. I mean, Australia was, once perceived as being, or commonly perceived as being a nation made up of a people. That was sort of like, well, that is what nationalists actually believe. We do believe that, we are a nation ultimately made up of a people. And in fact, it's the people who make the nation effectively. It's not the dirt that makes the nation. It's the people that make the nation. It's the sort of like the collective experience of the people and their biosphere, because, the people are effectively a biosphere. And, but what's happened, or what's been happening, is increasingly, it's like we're just kind of losing that, and it's a lot of it's like our leaders, or at least whether it's the senior economists or whether it's the politicians or the senior bureaucrats or whatever, it's like they're increasingly, I think, perceiving Australia as being little more than an economy made up of a population, which is, I think, a very different way to seeing things as, a nation made up of a people. But I think that's the kind of, where it comes from, a sort of technocratic way of viewing things, a kind of, dehumanizing way of viewing things. But yeah, I think that's absolutely the whole process that's taking place, and it's sad, but hopefully we can reverse it. I guess that's the the aim of the game, is to try and at some point, wake our people up and get them to sort of like take back their humanity, take back their society, take back our culture, take back our power. I think that's ultimately what is the desirable goal.
Yeah, absolutely, mate. You're spot on the money there. I couldn't agree with you more. And I think it is important. I think it is important that we do start to recognise these type of things. And I wanted to just talk about some of the aftermath that we've seen. We've spoken about here this evening some of the causes that we've seen. Cultural Marxism, all this type of stuff. And I just wanted to talk about some of the effects that we can witness, and some of the things that we can learn from just in this context here in society. And you mentioned, obviously, it's all about getting that word out there, trying to reverse things. And I think it's really key to have conversations like this. This is one of the things that really bind and get that information out there for people that are listening, for people that are being exposed to this type of information for the first time. And one of the things you can do to learn is to obviously look back at the past and look to other examples to see what happens when a society continues to head in these type of directions. And I wanted to talk about obviously the cultural revolutions that we've seen in the 20th century. We saw in China the Cultural Revolution that they had crippled the economy. It ruined millions of lives, and there was about a 10-year period of turmoil, bloodshed, hunger, all these type of things. And I've still got a newspaper here on my computer that was from an official mouthpiece, a newspaper over in China at the time, that urged the masses to, quote, clear away the evil habits of the old society. This is how far the indoctrination and the cultural Marxism had reached in China during the 20th century, that they had been urged to clear away the evil habits of old societies. And we saw schools and universities closed, churches, libraries, anything that represented what they described as feudal traditions was eradicated from China, all because of a progression in a so-called progression in their minds, similar to what we see today about the progressives that aren't really about progressing anything. It's more about division and regression to more tribal aspects of our humanity. And what we've seen in China was this type of thing happen. We also saw in Russia their cultural revolution changed ideologies in society. After their October Revolution that they had over there, they fundamentally rejected, the church. The state fundamentally rejected that in hopes really of the indoctrination of Marxist-Leninist ideology to citizens. So they banned traditionalist teachings and only really started to talk about this. Now, both of these, Bradley, obviously, they're extreme examples, and obviously they're not democracies like we are, and it's a bit different in these countries. But how do you feel, mate, about just observing these types of social shifts throughout history and seeing really what the aftermath is of what happens when a culture sways too far from the traditionalist things that made them what they are as a country, and really just become almost subjected to a new religion that's developed by whoever the propagators of the information are? Have you studied much about the cultural revolutions of the past, mate? What are your thoughts, and do you see any similarities between some of the cultural shifts that happened in these countries and some of the cultural shifts that we're seeing now in terms of, feminism and social movements and all this type of stuff? Do you see any correlation, and what are your thoughts on cultural revolutions, mate?
Yeah, that's some interesting comparisons. Obviously, I think, those Eastern Bloc countries, the Soviet Union, and what they went through in that period there in the 19 teens and the 1920s, and then, you mentioned the Chinese Cultural Revolution. I think probably both of those examples were probably a fair way away from what's the Australian experience is. I think because we are a Western Anglosphere country, but obviously there's pitfalls there, and there's things that we can learn from them. I think it sort of also highlights the enormous power of propaganda. I think that in China, the regime was very powerful, and not just like if you understand Chinese history as well. I mean, I've read books about China and what's going on there, but it's interesting because China has been like an authoritarian type of nation for almost continuously for like 2,500 odd years, and the creation of the Communist Party was sort of in many ways like a continuation of that. But communism was a very sort of malleable sort of system that was able to borrow from Chinese traditions whilst adding the sort of Marxist Leninist sort of dogmatism. And what it did with that cultural revolution in the 60s was absolutely, I guess, shocking and pretty unimaginable to us in 21st century Australia in many ways, because I kind of think we're in many ways very far removed from that. Yet at the same time, that horrible, unimaginable killing, all of those people, there were literally tens of millions of people who were murdered in that, Chinese Cultural Revolution. And when you think about it, that happened like mostly back in the 60s. That was really only a few short decades away. And it's like, obviously we're importing large numbers of Chinese people into our society at the moment ourselves. And, I think that's for many, many reasons a policy that's fraught with risk and danger and not a good idea. But as far as we in the West is concerned, it's like, we've had our effectively a cultural Marxist revolution. And you mentioned religion, and you're right. I mean, it's like cultural Marxism has become like the new type of religion in many ways. It's become, I liken it to it's sort of like filled the void in many ways that was originally sort of like dominated, if you like, by Christianity in Australia. For most of Australia's history, Christianity was the sort of like the dominant moral framework, if you like, in Australia. A lot of the the values that were commonly followed by people were sort of either Christian values or based on Christian values. But then since Christianity began to decline, especially amongst the white European population in Australia, I mean, we still have considerable numbers of Christians in Australia, but many of the new ones have sort of like been imported people from outside of Western countries, and we've even like had the churches and church representatives who have been all for this diversity, importing diversity, and that because it helps to fill the aisles of the churches and that, whereas the white European dominant population has actually in many ways either turn their backs on Christianity or become less Christian for whatever multitude of reasons. But inevitably, with the decline of Christianity, I think inevitably something else comes in and fills that void. And cultural Marxism is undoubtedly one of those things. The other thing that I think is worthy of a mention is what I call legalism. It's like increasingly we've become a society that's become increasingly litigious. It's like we've had politicians, many of them whom have law degrees, and we've had, politicians passing more and more laws. We've had more and more prominent law firms. We've had, the role played by lawyers and judges and magistrates in our society. And it's almost like the politicians pass laws that help to almost like favour that legal system and help to, create business for the lawyers and the legal system and that. And it's like, since we've lost faith in the divine and true world theories and that sort of thing, it's like increasingly legalism has become the powerful sort of framework that sort of, governs our behaviour. Instead of people their behaviour being governed by their consciences, which is, I think, was what happens with religion, and why religion can be so valuable to humanity. Increasingly, our behaviour is dictated to us by the law. Increasingly, we've got politicians passing more and more laws to try and set the agenda, not just set the agenda and mold the society, but also if you step outside of the law or step out of line sort of thing, then they'll put you in prison sort of thing. It's like we've become a very overly litigated, I think, society. We've got not just that, but also with the compensation culture as well. It's like it used to be back in the day, a few decades ago, if you fell off a ladder or something that was your own silly fault. Now, whereas nowadays, if somebody falls off a ladder, you see the manufacturer or something. We've become a very litigious society. Fortunately, we're not as bad as the USA. I think the USA is really shocking with their over litigation, but I think Australia is going more and more in that direction. And again, I think it's sort of it's filled the void, as has been the influence of cultural Marxism or political correctness. Again, I perceive, this is how I perceive political correctness. It's become like a substitute religion for some people. It's become extremely dogmatic. It's like the progressive left have their notions or their new notions of what is sacred. They have, I think, false concepts of sacred, false concepts of sin and heresy, false concepts of doom, false sacralizing of things that I don't think deserve to be considered sacred. Like I think the progressive left consider equality to be a sacred doctrine, even though equality is a very difficult thing to attain or measure, or and yet it's something like the progressive left are completely obsessed with attaining equality. And of course, then they constantly shift the goalposts to tell us what equality is. It used to be about trying to give people equality of opportunity, so everybody got access to drinking water and everybody got access to having their mail delivered, and we all had equal opportunity. Women and the different races of people all had the same opportunities to get jobs or go to school or whatever. And then increasingly it just becomes like they keep shifting the goalposts. They keep telling us, well, this is equality or that is equality. And I think, those are kind of like, equality is like a false idol of the progressive left. If you sort of like understand nature, you see it in nature. There's not really a lot of equality in nature. Obviously, there's some clone species or species that are like clones that have a degree of equality, but they're not, intelligent species. Whereas, we humans are highly a very individualistic species in the sense that, we've all got our individual traits. We're all different individuals. We've all, even people who are identical twins and might have a lot in common with each other, they're still, separate individuals from each other, and they'll still have differences in that. And obviously their minds are different. But, it's like, you can't actually attain equality, and yet it's constantly this obsession by some people to try to attain this seemingly impossible ideal. And I think I don't know if they do it deliberately or if they just do it instinctively or whatever, but it's something that they're incredibly often obsessed about. And I think that's just one area of a false religion or a false ideal. I'm going to have to wrap up soon, Ethan.
Yeah, you're right, mate. No, that's a fantastic analysis that you've given there, mate. I think that you touched on some great points there, just in relation to it being the new religion. I'm glad that you agree with me just on the new religion aspect of there. And you said something very important there, talking about expanding our minds and this notion of legalism becoming sort of almost a subsection of this new cultural Marxist religion that has come into society. But at the same time, they're also suppressing our physical realities in more ways than others. So they want us to expand our minds beyond the constructs of gender, of sexual normalities, of separation from faith, all of these things that we've seen in other cultures throughout history, China and Russia and these types of things. But I think one of the things that you've spoken about that I think you hit the nail on the head there, mate, was you called it obviously the revolution of the mind. It's almost like a revolution of the mind in a sense that has happened throughout Western society. And as you've said, that void is just being filled with this new sort of system of beliefs that are being put through society. And you've given me a good idea, mate, as you were just describing that. What I'm going to do is I'm going to create an image that has the new testaments on it that are going to be the PC testaments of the new religion. I'm going to create a photo. I've just thought of it now, mate. Because of you, I'm going to do that because that's essentially what it is. You're talking about they're almost like, they're almost like commandments. These commandments,
yes,
you know what I mean?
I've used that I've thought, political correctness does have its commandments. It does have its, very strict dogmatism that, you have to adhere to this particular dogmatism, this particular doctrine. There's only one way that you're allowed to think about, climate change, or you're only allowed to think one way about homosexuality, or you're allowed to think only one way about diversity. And if you transgress those sacred, like dogmatism, then you are perceived as being a heretic or a sinner. Again, those new false concepts of sin and heresy, and the whole climate change alarmism is like, I think, a false concept of doom as well. So it's like political correctness has become this new religion. And, I think that like all like all, or not just a religion, but a cult. That's what it is. It is like it's actually got a lot of things. Political correctness, the cult of PC, has a lot in common with a lot of fundamentalist, religious cults, like say Scientology or something like that. It's like, this is the dogmatism, this is the doctrine. You've got to stick to this, and if you don't, we're going to hunt you down. We're going to find some way to punish you. And, I think ultimately fundamentalist cults impose their agenda ultimately through bullying and brainwashing. I think those are the two methods that fundamentalist cults are able to control people and able to impose their will on people. And we see that all the time with political correctness too. It's imposing its agenda through bullying and brainwashing. But political correctness is so sinister and so subversive that most people are not sort of aware of this happening. They're not really aware of what is going on, and that's part of the pushback against political correctness. It's part of I think that we are becoming more educated about it, how it works, its methodology, and we're not only educating ourselves but increasingly educating each other and hopefully educating the wider community to understand, how political correctness works. Because it's like, if we are ever to sort of like defeat an enemy, I think you first of all have to work that enemy out, work out what it is and how it moves and how it operates and, how you can eventually hopefully defeat that enemy.
Yeah, absolutely, mate. I couldn't have said it better myself. And just final thoughts before you head off, mate. What are some of the things that we can do to turn this type of stuff around, even if little small movements with ourselves, with our communities? What do you recommend? Just as some final thoughts that we can do to combat everything that we've spoken about here tonight, mate.
Okay, look, it's like I use the term like chipping away at the dam wall. Now, I don't know if it's a dam or maybe it's more like a cavern that we're living in. We're kind of like, to me, it's like we're living in a kind of, I think this is kind of like an age of lunacy that we're living in now in many ways. We're not living in an age of enlightenment or an age of great moral standing or anything. It's like we're kind of living in this upside down crazy clown world in many ways, and it's like we've got all of this amazing technology and all of this amazing information and access to information, and yet we've had that dehumanizing, demoralizing effect, and it's like many of our values are becoming increasingly not rational but irrational. They're going in the wrong direction. And I think that in order to, I think there is that pushback against it. The realization of that is absolutely growing. It is growing. The pushback against political correctness is growing, and I expect it will continue to grow and build and gain momentum. But inevitably, it is a process, and we all have to go through that process. We all have to, keep on fighting that fight. We have to. I kind of perceive it as being a little bit like what I call the patriotic swarm. It's a little bit like, if you understand what happened with that counterculture revolution in the 1960s and 70s, right? When cultural Marxism first became strong and first really got its foothold in the West, I think it largely happened because people were like, sorry, I just lost my place a bit, but it's like, that became powerful, and it was like a swarm. It was like, it wasn't like that people were necessarily following any one leader or even a small group of leaders. It was like the entire movement changed. There was like, suddenly that youth movement, really radically changed the society. And it was a little bit like the different units within a swarm of, let's say, locusts or ants or bees or wasps or whatever. And what gave the swarm the strength was not, the individual bees or wasps or ants. It was the whole unit working together. That's what gives a swarm the strength. And I think it's probably a similar thing for us in this movement against political correctness. I don't know what you call this movement, whether it's, nationalism's part of it. Somebody suggested the term wokeism.
I love it.
Yeah, I thought it was good too. Woke. This is a wokest movement. Like we're waking up, but I think it is like, it will be like a swarm. It will be all of those little bees or wasps or locusts or insects, sort of, all of us together making our little contribution to the swarm. All of us, or enough of us, chipping away at the cavern walls until eventually we can shine some light. We can widen those gaps. We can shine some light into the tunnel, sort of thing. And, for a lot of us, people with the education and the knowledge of these things, we have to be like torch bearers. We have to try and, shine that torch through the long, dark, lonely tunnel, because that's what it is sometimes. It is long and dark and lonely, but we need people to be those torch bearers. We need people to shine that torch, to shine that light, and hopefully, at some point we can light the whole cavern, and that's what we're going to one day do.
Absolutely, mate. No, that's a fantastic note to end on there, and I couldn't agree with you more. Just keep chipping away, and conversations like this are vital in that process of chipping. Getting information out there, connecting with each other, and obviously just sharing everything that's going on. Well, mate, I really appreciate you joining me here tonight. As I mentioned, this is Bradley from the Australian Protectionist Party. You can head to protectionist.net. Is that the correct website for the Australian Protectionist Party, mate?
Yes, that's right. www.protectionist.net. We're also on Facebook. We're on Twitter. We're on Gab. And we have a YouTube channel. And this chat should be up on our YouTube channel soon enough. So thank you very much indeed, Ethan. It was an extremely interesting and enjoyable conversation. And I look forward to talking to you again at some future point.
Yeah, thank you so much for that, mate. And for all the members out there, remember just to head over to tottnews.com. Leave your thoughts below on this discussion. As I mentioned, make sure you interact with Bradley and the Australian Protectionist Party. On the 27th of July 2019, from TOTT News, we were signing off. We will catch you all down the road. Thanks, everyone.